Record now. I would like to welcome the first affirmative speaker to begin the debate.
Sorry for the delay, I'll get started now. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
The coalition of every centre-left party around the world is a combination of educated progressives and people who are working class. Families who have for generations been in trade unions, who work blue-collar jobs, but trust that centre-left parties will listen to their interests and deliver things like education and healthcare and welfare for their children. This latter group is leaving the centre-left enormously. Without them, the coalitions that centre-left parties rely on for electoral success will fall apart, and the centre-left will risk repeatedly losing election after election after election. The negative team is to justify why it is that these parties losing a central part of their electoral coalition or not actively try to stem that hemorrhage and try to keep their coalitions alive. That is a pretty big burden that I'm excited to see how they try to overcome. Who are these parties? What are their coalitions and what are their interests? These are central left parties like the ALP, like the Democratic Party, like the Social Democrats in Germany, like Labour in the UK and the NZ. Notably, they vary to some degree around the world on exactly what they ideologically support, but we would say it's pretty fair to characterize that centre-left parties usually keep an ideological big tent, which is to say, they have a broad scope of voters ideologically and demographically. They typically support government interventions like, for instance, welfare, like housing, like healthcare, and a lot have historical ties to labour movements. They also are typically and increasingly socially progressive, for instance, supporting policies like gay marriage. They're already, I think, because of the fact that they're ideological big tents, are quite flexible on issues like defence, like national security, like immigration, which typically are contested with right-wing parties during elections. So what are their interests? I think it's electoral above all else. And that's because I think it's the prerequisite for these parties to enact their agendas. So any argument in this debate that turns on, well, if you don't do this, you won't be able to enact your agenda, obviously has to pass the prerequisite barrier of getting that party elected in the first place and making sure they still stay the party of government. Obviously, these parties have the incentive to oppose, their oppositions and make sure they are not enacting their agenda which they disagree with. And I would just say, more on a basis of ego, parties want to have a substantial legacy, they want notoriety, and they want access to the funding that often comes with being the government of a nation. So how would these parties, we would think, go about this? And just I would briefly note, the wording of this topic does give us a little bit of fiat, but we're not going to try and rely on that like a lot. We would say there are 4 things that they probably do. First thing is rebrand their current policy prescriptions to now, things they already support, that are already a part of their policy platform. Things like expansions to education, to childcare, to healthcare, to welfare, to frame it specifically around the ways it benefits people who are from the rural working class, who are less educated, people who come from, for instance, suburban or rural areas. Secondly, shifting policies to appeal to people that have suffered the most recently under policies, for instance, that have seen manufacturing jobs leave many nations. For instance, we would think probably these parties would become a little bit more hostile to free trade, probably would become a bit more friendly towards protectionist policies. The third thing, and I think this is critical, is they would explicitly make the effort to nominate candidates who are from this voter base, from the rural working class, or just working class in general. People like John Fetterman in the Pennsylvania Senate election, or like Rapacholi in the Hunter Valley in Sydney, in New South Wales. Those kind of candidates who actually look like the area that they represent, look like the voter base that we're talking about in this debate, we would make an effort to nominate them more. Fourthly, we would redirect campaign resources and funding to winning swing seats within those areas quite aggressively. So, why is it successful in retaining and or winning over this set of voters? So I guess it's important to characterize here why education polarization has recently resulted in the voting loss of this group of people. Firstly, and we say this is critical, increasingly they do not see themselves represented in the leaderships of these parties. Many of these voters in the upper Midwest were turned off by what they perceived as the disconnected coastal elitism of Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. We say that that's not an inherent part of these areas. That's just these voters don't see themselves in these parties anymore, and they don't trust them to represent the people that they see around them every day. Secondly, globalization has disproportionately hurt these voters. Their jobs have been offshored, and COVID has exacerbated this by forcing them often in disproportionate quantities to reskill. Thirdly, these are communities that have received oftentimes less government attention. They are often forgotten. Think the outer suburbs of many cities, for instance, like Campbelltown, or like the Hunter Valley of New South Wales, or like the upper Midwest. These kinds of areas that have received neglect and often don't trust the government and therefore don't trust centre-left parties. So why does it work? First, we can, at the very least, we say that populist right parties currently have a disproportionate monopoly on messaging towards these people, because they're the ones that are currently making an active effort to commit these people. We say centre-left parties ought try, they ought dilute that messaging, they ought contest it explicitly. These people are not diehard voters for the populist right. They often have historical family legacies within trade unions, within voting for these parties, to vote for centre-left parties. And they have only recently started flipping. If this team wants to say they are dedicated far-right voters, and that just A, goes against the info slide, but B, goes against the idea that the working class has historically had an interest to vote for these parties. Second, we fix the problem of representation because we have people from mining towns who look like people from mining towns as the candidate for these parties, rather than people who've been put in. And I think an example of how this has been terrible for centre-left parties is the elite American Christina Keneally, who was put into a seat in Southwest Sydney and lost it, a safe centre-left seat, and managed to somehow lose it. We wouldn't do this. We would instead put in people like Diliman who would actually have won that seat, and we would fix that problem. Promises that made by populist parties can be delivered, things like higher wages, things like trade protectionism. We think centre-left parties can well and truly deliver on these things. But fourthly, we think they're likely to be able to now mobilise powerful trade union support. They're more directly speaking to those interests. Think, for instance, the ALP has the ability to access the Australian Council of Trade Unions to get their funding, to get their media, to get their time, and to get their manpower, far more when those parties are now speaking to those interests. Why is it essential to retain those coalitions? And the important thing to state here is that you cannot win elections solely with the educated elite of nations. They are too small a group to rely on, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, university-educated voters are just not empirically a majority of the population anywhere in the world, and they won't be anytime soon. But even if all of them vote for centre-left parties, in fact, the influence like university-educated voters vote for right-wing parties for the reason they see them as beneficial for their overriding interests, things like taxation, things like they don't support welfare. So, like, you cannot base your coalition entirely on those people. But also, gerrymandering in many parts of the world has had an outsized influence, has left rural areas, often working class, with a disproportionate outsized influence on the electoral process. Swing states are far more likely to have high concentrations of these voters. If you lose those swing states, you lose elections, so you must appeal those people. The importance of this argument is basically, in the absence of some way of retaining this group, which we provide, and which negative definitionally do not, there is absolutely no way for these parties to continue to retain government. They consistently stay in opposition, they never win. Just briefly, why this doesn't turn away educated people. At the worst, they vote for far left and then they're in the coalition, but there's less of these people anyway, and these are just rebranding policies you would have done anyway. For that reason, I'm super proud to affirm.
Thank you to the Prime Minister for that speech, and I'd like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition to begin the case for side negative. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Right, give me a sec. So just reiterate, gender pronouns, either. Starting my speech now. 3, 2, 1. So the comparative that negative is going to defend is that we are going to continue directing a lot of the resources that affirmative defense, but rather towards the university audiences that we think are going to be a much more stable, secure voter segment, rather than attempting to vie for the strategy that we think was unproven to be their side to be that successful. A couple of responses towards their side. So first of all, I do agree, they do have fiat to suggest that you can attempt to advocate and seek electoral gains from the conservative parties, or like conservative regions, or like the less educated regions rather, but they need to prove specifically why you get those success cases, to which the analysis that we hear coming from their side is that you're able to challenge the disproportionate monopoly that a lot of Republican parties and populist groups have. So I just want to note that their side is contingent at proving that you will actually be successful at contesting that monopoly over them just being able to outcompete you within these regions, which is what I'm going to prove later. The second thing is that if they wanted to claim that oftentimes they feel disconnected by policy by people such as Hillary because of elitism, I just want to note that this is more than just an elitism problem, right? It's the fact that the campaign of people like Donald Trump was simply like oversimplistic, and a lot of people are able to buy this because of campaigns such as Make America Great Again or Build a Wall. So what their side needs to prove is that in order for them to be able to challenge the monopoly, they need to provide they're going to be able to create campaigns that are equally as simple, if not similar to understand and digest for a lot of these people, which I'll later argue to be a lot worse under their side. With this, I'm going to forward 3 arguments. First, why we think that is going to be an unsuccessful strategy that actually is counterproductive and means that you get less support from those voter groups that you want to get. So I just want to note this is a very responsive argument, right? Because the thesis of the government case is that it's contingent on proving success and that the attempt to get the campaign will lead to any form of electoral gains. There are 3 reasons to suggest why that will not happen. First, because as what affirmative already outlines, they are already captured by right-wing populists that have been campaigning this way before you. There's an entrenched system of right-wings already brainwashing you with their campaign media and things such as Fox News to make you believe in abortion, for instance, to be a bad thing by religious fundamentalists, or Trump spouting things such as anti-immigration. The reason why you cannot overpower that is because there's a first mover's advantage, right? Like the motion takes place in the present, but the problem is that the Republican Party and a lot of the other conservative parties in different countries have started way before you, which means that you're not going to be able to overpower this. But second of all, oftentimes it's hard to understand a lot of these policies by the center left because of 2 reasons. One, because a lot of these right-wing people who are less educated already perceive these individuals as elitist, so which means that they're never going to buy the center-left candidate at all. But number 2, it's not going to be easy to understand, right? Compare that to other political leanings, because it's easy to understand Medicare for all, which is a far left suggestion. It's also easy to believe in a multi-payer healthcare system, which is a suggestion that comes from right wingers. But it's hard to understand specific micro suggestions that a lot of center left people suggest, such as Medicare reform, which isn't necessarily nationalizing a health insurance, or for instance, police reform, which isn't necessarily defunding the police, which means that oftentimes it's incredibly specific, oftentimes incredibly complicated, which is unpalatable for the vast majority of a lot of these people. But the third reason to suggest why don't get these voters is because do you think that you're likely going to backfire and they're going to be framed as inconsistent? Because yes, it is true that you're going to be competing against these other groups, but the problem is that they're going to see the shift in tactic of you wanting to vie for this voter base. Take note that the process of seeking electoral gains also means that you are willing to concede being closer towards the middle just so that you can appeal to those lesser educated people because they bought the stances of a lot of the Republicans and conservative people within those regions, which means that you're going to get a lot of weaponization against you for being perceived as flip-floppy, right? So I want to meta this argument specifically because one, this nullifies a lot of the arguments that their side wanted to suggest, but it's not just about the lack of success that is damaging, but it's the fact that you're going to get worse traction, and it's probably the case that you're going to get a lot of bashing from a lot of these groups, which actually detracts and creates negative implications for your own party, which is bad. So we think that there is a guaranteed harm of losing net supporters from those individuals because now they're more likely to be demonizers against you. Second argument, why we think that you're going to lose the guaranteed voter base that you have. we would suggest that status quo is already working, right? So we disagree with their premise that university students are not swing and majority members of the population, right? Like these are people that consist 2/3 of the population. Structurally, a lot of people need education, and the reason why there's growing amounts of people in the status quo, as stated in the info slide, is because people need to get a university degree so that they can increase their employability, which is why a lot of individuals, such as Pete Buttigieg, were able to be popular among universities because they're able to campaign door to door in a lot of these different places, such as UPenn, such as Harvard, not even just the Ivy League schools, right? Even a lot of the local universities that may be of like community college. But the problem is that you turn off a significant amount of your own voter base in the process of seeking electoral gain from the other side because you're moving closer towards the middle, which means that you forgo specific previous stances, which means that you're framed as pandering, right? Which is a lot worse. The second mechanism to suggest this is actually what they purported in their policy. Because now, if you want to get someone from that region, from those different regions, that means you're associating yourselves with the conservatives under their side, which means that it becomes far harder for you to actually get support because you're perceived as a betrayal of your own political party. So as a result of this, number one, you lose votes because they feel turned off by this. Number two, you lose political capital and funding from key social movements and non-government organizations that often send you millions of dollars that allow you to campaign. But number three, we think that there is now a higher susceptibility that those people from university could turn to right-wing audience or to turn to the right-wing parties. Because take note, it's not a fully captured audience base, right? You're not going to get these voter bases regardless. Because oftentimes, again, the political parties that exist on the other side, like the Republicans, for instance, are going to compete against you. Oftentimes, there's a lot of counter pressures by a lot of people who are within university to want to become Republican. So, right, so the earlier sections of like past history is still somewhat true. Like maybe some people in university want to maintain wealth, which is why they don't want to support tax reform. They also want to access jobs that Republicans attempt to protect, such as big finance, big oil, or big pharma. But the problem is that when you're not campaigning to them, you're increasing the susceptibility of them being captured. On a note, there's an opportunity costing your ability to advocate towards these groups, right? Because you can't do both. One, because you have to trade off a significant amount of capital trying to capture a new audience base, right? This is lots of money. You have to spend time on outlets, voting booths, slogans. This is a lot of money that means that you're going to have to not campaign for those people. Number two, the reason why it's a trade-off is for betrayal that I mentioned. We think the problem is that there is a certain harm of you losing your voter base, which is also going to remove electability. The last reason to suggest why this is bad, and this is where we move on to the third argument, is that even if we concede the best case that they're able to get win, we think that's going to be problematic insofar as you're going to lead to over-compromising within that seat of power. Because now you're caught in a double bind. Because if you attempt to do something that's overly conservative, you now turn off the base that was like center-left. If you attempt to vice versa, right? And so as a result, you piss off everyone. You're forced to be static and probably are not able to do the core things that you want to do as your center of party, of trying to help vulnerable minorities, of attempting to slightly increase minimum wage, of trying to do things such as increase medical reform. Because the problem on their side, as in the process of trying to over pander, you are now shocked because you don't want to piss off both audiences, and at that point you do nothing with your power, right? So this is exactly the reason why, for instance, Joe Manchin is hated from both the Republicans and the Democrats because he neither is willing to support things like minimum wage, but at the same time, he's also anti like immigration at the same time. So you get the worst of both worlds instead of the best. And as a result, we think that you're going against the core principles that you want to defend in as a center-left party, just far worse, right? Because even if you do win, it becomes nothing. Power is meaningless if you can't do anything with it. Thank you.
I thank the first negative speaker for their speech, and I welcome the second affirmative speaker to continue the case for the University of Sydney Union. Here.
Hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. The problem with this negative team is they assume that because someone is working class and because they did not go to university, they are automatically conservative pilled. But the problem with that argument is that it is just not true. The reason why a lot of this voter base have voted conservative in the last 50 years is because they feel like progressive parties have ignored them. They feel like they don't make active efforts to be active in their geographical areas and run people as candidates who represent them clearly. We are the team that actually fixes that. When we tell you ad nauseum at Oscar that this voting base is hugely untapped, because they are not ideologically driven to the Conservative Party. They are just there because they have no other option. We are the team that explains there is a huge volume of people that progressive parties in the centre left need to win over to win elections in the future. I'm going to ask two questions in this speech. First of all, are these attempts likely to be successful? And second of all, how many people actually lie within these voting bloc and are they important? First of all, the question of are they successful? Because this negative team, it tells us two things. They say that, first of all, simplistic slogans like Make America Great Again are easier for these people to digest. And second of all, they are largely already captured. Four things in response here. The first thing we would point out is this is just extremely classist in that these people can obviously digest things that aren't just really simplistic slogans, even if they are members of the working class and don't have an elite education. The reason why they voted for Trump was not because he had a slogan like, let's make America great again. It's because he did things like protectionism, and it's because he was actually visible in the Midwest and in the Rust Belt. That's why they voted for him. However, the Liberals obviously have the opportunity to also go in and capture that voter base, which I'm going to explain next. Second of all, it is actually incredibly easy for these parties to rebrand their policies in ways that appease this bloc. That's because often these parties are conducive to what these people care about, in that often these people have low wages, they're on the minimum wage, often they are very dependent on welfare. It is the centre-left parties that are often the best at creating this kind of policy. The way that they can then push it to these people is explain that they care about things like industry and they care about things like manufacturing jobs by virtue of those welfare policies, but also by simply being more physically present, they are able to capture these people when they can actually compete with the Republicans. Thirdly, they say that, well, you have a first mover advantage as a Republican and they've already been captured. 4 lines of response. First of all, obviously that is not true. They are being captured because they've been ignored, not because they are ideologically attached to the Conservative Party. Obviously, there are some people who are uneducated in, for example, America, that are always going to vote Republican. We would argue that there is a huge majority of them left, though, that aren't in this ideological sphere, that often do not turn out to vote at all. And it is only when you explain the ways in which that right-wing Conservative Party that is low on tax and high on elite people have screwed you over in the past that you are able to empower and motivate these people to come out to vote. Thirdly, though, we would point to the fact that this is a recent phenomenon shift, so that by virtue of the fact this only happened over the last 50 years, it's clear that they don't have these deep ideological ties with Conservative parties, so they are actually able to be appeased. But finally, this group is growing in number, so it would be silly and foolish for centre-left parties to ditch them entirely just because they believe they've already been captured. By virtue of the fact that swing states exist, it's clear that there are always groups of people that aren't being captured by certain parties. We would argue that less educated people living in parts of Australia and parts of the US are in that group that are yet to be captured. Fourthly, they tell us that they've been viewed as elite, and that means that they aren't likely to opt into them. That is the problem that we fix. The reason why they don't vote for them is because they are viewed as elite. It is only when you start to appease these people by playing to the things that they actually care about and that have impacted them that you are able to capture them. You can appease them with your policy. You can do things like run local candidates from careers and from industries which these people actually care about. That is how you are able to get them on side. Second of all, how many of them are there? This negative team says that, well, you need university degrees, which means that these, elites of people who have education are becoming a far bigger voting bloc and you lose them, and that is a problem. First of all, uni students are the far most likely to always stay left. And that's because they are far further left than the average person by virtue of the fact they care about education policy, they care about things like debt cancellation. So that means that the chances of you losing those university students because you start catering to these other people are incredibly small. Because what we tell you at first is that what you do to get this new voting bloc is just rebrand your current policies. And the kind of things that you were likely to ditch are not the things that university students care deeply about, which is often socially progressive policy, but instead you do things like become a little bit more economically conservative, perhaps, things that university students are less likely to care about. But also, the absolute worst case is that these uni students end up voting far left instead. So they vote like for the Greens, for example, instead of for Labor. That's not a loss for us either, because obviously those parties are still in coalition with us. So even if you vote for them instead, that is not a huge net loss for us. But we would also say that if we lose 10% of university students, but gain 40% of this huge uneducated bloc, by sheer numbers game, that is obviously a win. Thirdly, even if university rates are increasing, like this negative team tells us, we would argue that there is always going to be a huge group of people who do not get educated in a tertiary fashion. And that's because there's always going to be people who A, have no interest in getting educated, B, don't have the resources or money, or C, are just in a family where education is less important. And so that means that the group of people that go to university is always going to be of at least a significantly big enough volume to worth catering to them. At the moment in the status quo, when progressive centre-left parties do not cater to these people, the opportunity cost of doing that is huge. Because we tell you at first that at the moment, the right-wing parties have a monopoly over these people because there is no one else competing with them. But when you start competing with them, that is when these people will realise that there are policies that the centre-left supports that are actually incredibly beneficial to them. Policies like welfare, policies like increase in the minimum wage, policies like supporting local industry are all things that centre-left parties care deeply about. The problem is that at the moment doing that is going to be really important. Why do you not lose your voter bloc generally? Two main reasons, because this is one of the key things that Negative is hell-bent on by telling us that you are going to lose everyone. First of all, the policy is still inherently the same. It is just A, rebranded, or B, targeted to a different group of people. So for example, instead of being like welfare policies benefit university students who can't get a job, you say welfare policies benefit people who've been screwed over by COVID, for example, and we're going to help those people who are much more likely to be less educated. But second of all, you're able to market the same policies in different ways, in different areas. Like people who are marketing and politically campaigning are very good at being flexible and adapting their policy rhetoric to different geographical locations. That is obviously something that the centre-left blocs could do, in that when they're in rural areas, they can talk about the benefits of X policy differently to when they're in urban areas, they can talk about the different benefits of the same policy. The important thing to realize at the end of this debate is this is a hugely untapped voting bloc that are not ideologically right. They vote for them out of necessity. It is only when you start competing with these people properly that you are able to tap into a hugely volume sheer voter base, we affirm.
Thanks, Sekanaf. Welcome the second negative speaker to continue the case for side negative. You're here.
All right. Hello everyone. My name is Luigi Hiamde. Virgin Browsing Day. No POIs. All right. I'll start my speech in a moment. Okay. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. My argument today is gonna be very simple. I'm gonna talk about why even if you get these gains, these less educated voters are unreliable as a voting group in the long term. Before this, a few points of response. I'm going to have two sets of responses. The first set of responses will be against the accusation of elitism in the Democrat or center-left party. And number two, I'm going to talk about how do we deal with the untapped market of less educated voters. So firstly, talking about the elitism in the Democrat party. So I want to start this response by spinning the claim on elitism. I would argue elitism in the Democrat Party or in center-left parties, particularly in the last general election for Biden, was successful for the Democrats as a center-left party. And the structural reasons for this includes as follows. 3 things I want to mention here that directly respond to them. Number 1, less educated voters were actually also the ones who voted the least during the COVID pandemic crisis and also vote the lowest amounts during many of these different elections, which demonstrates how unloyal they are and how unlikely they are to be an effective ally for any party. Yes, they voted for Trump, but those were the ones that statistically, empirically, showed the strongest decrease in percentages for Trump's voter base, which shows, and they didn't even vote for Biden, by the way, they just didn't turn up to vote, because it shows that they're an ineffective ally for the party and they're only swayed by short-term interests. And that isn't the fault of the fact that they can't calculate or they cannot process it on their own. It's that, as the previous speaker agrees, many of these issues sometimes, like, they are dissatisfied with government in general, or for other reasons. It's very costly to turn up to vote. And in many countries where election is not a holiday, it's often much harder for them to take the extra effort to go to vote. Number two, Biden's financing from moderate to left corporations and endorsements from universities, which was his tipping point against candidates like Sanders or other progressive candidates like Elizabeth Warren, were ones that allowed him to increase his reach and his effectiveness across more moderate left educated voters through a greater coalition that was very, very influential in those universities to activate across regions that are vote rich. And vote rich regions are also those that are highly correlated to be the ones that are typically heavily politically concentrated, economically concentrated, and also educationally concentrated. And that's why we think that's a very high tipping point in terms of getting the middle class to higher class educated voting base to be able to go. Number three, I would argue elitism is a precondition for improving education access at higher and lower levels. So I want to contest the response of the previous speaker that you will always have the educational elite in universities. The real response is that in reality, university education actually empirically tends to make people more centrist because they're exposed to more perspectives and they learn more from different universities, university professors that are more liberal and more conservative because there's a very large pool of them. But it's the additional campaigning, we would argue, by leftist parties that make them be more exposed to progressive ideology, because maybe their parents are owners of a CEO corporation or a pharmaceutical agency, but they're a bit more exposed to about the interests of workers, or being more exposed to Obama's ideology of trying to work for healthcare and social inclusion for Black minorities and all of that. So I would argue this tipping point is why we need to contest conservative influence in tertiary institutions. We have more technocrats that are more progressive in the sense that they want more government intervention for accessible healthcare, and we have more effective and well-trained politicians to run for office eventually, and we have very great social organizations that are run by those leftist individuals too. You lose that if you, and this is the impacting now, you prioritize less educated voters, which increases the likelihood of them being disconnected from this moderate and educational elite because you threaten their sources of income. You also associate yourself with an unreliable voting base, and you also make it more likely for the educational elites to trend towards the conservatives because it's so easy to default to what your parents want. In short, you weaken the capacity of the center-left party in general. Second issue, how do we deal with the untapped market of less educated voters? The response of the previous speaker was to say that liberals had a failed opportunity to rebrand their policy to appease this bloc. And their claim was, we'll have the same policy, we'll just rebrand it. Our argument is that center-left parties cannot go too far progressive for a variety of reasons as well. In the United States in particular, just using that as an example, not the generalization, it associates them too much with communism, which all individuals have been indoctrinated to be against, and also because it threatens campaign financing of a vast majority of the rest of the moderate left politicians within these parties too. So on a first level, we say rebranding is significantly limited on the left because you can't just lie about a healthcare program that involves the private market or free trade policies that are directly anti-globalization, whereas the right, which is exposed to nationalist ideology, but also corporate ideology. Like, it's very easy for Trump to still say, well, I'm America first, but pro-business for America, and still be pro-capitalism, while still being able to oppose many of these free trade policies at the same time. So it's a more leeway to capture many of these individuals. So even if you can rebrand your campaign, it is a significant sunk cost for the party that has less gains than intended. The additional response from AF is that these less educated voters are growing in number. So I don't want to go into this hula baloo of like which is greater or not. I would just argue for the moment that this is not necessarily true because education rates have been going up. But even if this is not the case, I would just argue that, again, I'll argue now that they're less important, even if they are greater in numbers. So here's where we go down now, where they're unreliable. So this is the argument. Why they are unreliable long-term. Premise. Less educated voters may vote for you in one generation or one general election, but they are unreliable participants for your party in the following ways. Number one, they are primarily driven by the potential for immediate income gains. And since any administration usually significantly has difficulty in getting them to turn out to vote, they are more vulnerable to the narrative that any change would be good. And I would just argue any administration, whoever gets in power, usually doesn't always accomplish much because there are divisions in Congress and Senate, and it's often very hard to get any policy done that substantially changes the lives of these poor individuals, which is why they can vote once for one party in one administration, but they could flip to the next very much so in the next because they're dissatisfied with government in general. I just want to argue that as a structural reasons to why they're unreliable. Number two, their social obligations and beliefs often tend to be connected to many traditionalist institutions that are more overwhelming in their life, like the Catholic Church, which motivates some sentiments in them to be sexist, to be racist, and more nationalist. That alone divides the Democrat Party. It divides them against other voting base because you won't be affiliated with these people, but also it means it's very easy for the Conservative Party to flip them back when these social obligations inevitably take precedence over the next few years. But lastly, the less educated do not have the capacity to sufficiently organize themselves. Now, again, this is not to claim that they're intellectually inferior. It's just that the capital and the ability to organize yourself in social civic organizations to continuously survey their preferences compared to the more educated who can organize more in social movements of students, like are organized like in Black Lives Matter, that can do the privilege because they're in a university setting, makes it harder for them to continuously have a reliable volunteering-based group for your party. These reasons demonstrate that they're unreliable party members in the long run, which even in the best case, it puts an upper ceiling to your tenure as an administration, and in most cases, will still use a significant amount of resources on campaigning for a bunch of these less educated communities who would likely be difficult to reach in the next election. Because remember, what's the trade-off when you are not just rebranding, but you have to change parts of your campaign or change the politicians you are sending? It also means you have to set up new polling stations. You have to build new facilities, new volunteering organizations. If these volunteering organizations are ones that are sunk costs or don't get enough membership because of the unreliability of these organizations, this is the impacting now of the argument, we do not have committed members. We need committed members to finance our organizations, to gain more membership and volunteers to develop grassroots organizations, to continuously have activation in multiple areas in the states where we have influence. And thus, I would argue middle class educated voters or higher class educated voters, even if you're arguing that less educated voters are growing in number because of inequality reasons, our established bases where we have this financing are much larger still because they're reliable. For these reasons, side with us.
Thanks, Second Nick, and now welcome the final substantive speaker, the affirmative team, to finish off the substantive portion of the affirmative team's case. You hear.
Yeah, where I'm muted. Hello, can I be heard? Yeah, cheers. For most of that second negative, I wasn't sure whether they were arguing our case. They get up there and say, these people are really unpredictable. They often don't turn out. Yes, that's exactly what we argued. There is a huge amount of apathy that these voters feel. Why do they think that is true? Do they think it just happens by chance? It happens because these people on a daily basis feel constant neglect from the fact there is not a single party that will give them policy that they care about deeply. It's because they look at the fact that they have mass unemployment and incredibly high crime rates because the party that used to support them, that used to genuinely be working class party that was going to protect these manufacturing jobs, is the party that has now actively left them. That is exactly the type of person that this re-imaging, that this policy shift, these actually taking these leaders from are going to capture. And they themselves see that these people are not viciously, strongly right-wing that we can never sway. They themselves see that the barrier in this debate is literally they're a bit apathetic, that they kind of like really don't have a good party to vote for. This is the easiest voter for us to win, and it's a slam dunk side affirmative. First, which voters do we actually need to win this debate? Side opposition immediately has problems because they do not respond to the core of our case, which is that center-left coalitions are at the moment comprised significantly of less educated voters. We explained that you're bleeding working class votes like nobody's business at the moment. And you urgently need to stem that bleeding. You need to stop these people from not turning out at the ballot box. You need to stop these people from believing in far-right extremism, on blaming the fact that they're losing their jobs on immigrants. And you fall prey to all those narratives when you stop empowering trade union leaders under your side, when you stop actually giving policy to the people on the ground that have voted for you for a long time, but are increasingly growing skeptical of you. And literally, they do not respond to this argument. Immediately wins us the debate. But now let's engage where they actually do give us some analysis. They first talk about less educated voters. And I think the problem with this analysis is twofold. First, a lot of their mechanization is just simply untrue. They say there aren't many organizations on the ground. You're the second mover, so the other side has clearly captured all of these. What? What organizations do you think that we don't have? But we actually do have the two critical organizations that live in working class communities. First, as we explained from first speaker, it is typically trade unions that are the most connected to center-left movements. These are the types of groups that are the most vocal activists, that give the largest sets of donations, that have the greatest media platforms to be able to capture these low-educated votes. But second, it isn't just that, it is grassroots groups. If this side genuinely seems to think it is groups of mothers on Facebook, it is forms of grassroots activists that care about the fact that their children are in prison, it is always going to be a center-left movement that captures those grassroots organizations. When you tell mothers' societies, we are going to provide you cheaper welfare. When you tell Indigenous communities, we are going to prevent over-policing. Those are the types of policies that center-left groups overwhelmingly captured because they came across as very compassionate, they came across as very empathetic, and that is why you actually do get the first mover advantage that they cared about so deeply. And you do actually get the organizations that help these communities turn out to vote in the first place. The last analysis is, but these people vote out because the cost to vote is high and you need new polling stations. In case you haven't noticed, the vast majority of center-left parties tend to support higher voter turnout. They tend to support building more polling booths. That is because they typically have large racial minorities that vote for them. And as such, they're already trying to encourage this voter turnout. And it is just totally unclear that you don't want to lose the block that is going to turn out more by the policies that you're doing. That is why this is synergistic with what these parties are currently doing. The last thing to note here is we just explained why these seats are more likely to be rural seats, and why rural seats disproportionately have greater power, because you can win the popular vote under their side as much as you want. You don't win the election when you don't win enough actual seats on the ground. And the second piece of analysis that they don't respond to is that swing states are overwhelmingly typically those with a large percentage of the population that is low education, because swing states typically have a division or a polarization of these two different groups together, and you are going to lose unless you at least gain some of those low education voters. And that is why it is incredibly likely these are more important electoral groups, and therefore why even if we lose the question on more educated voters, we're still going to win this debate. Finally, we don't lose this question on educated voters anywhere near as much side opposition gives. The first thing that they say is these groups are politically important and they serve us. And this comes to their absolute detriment. And straight from first, we explained that cities are overwhelmingly gerrymandered. They do not have anywhere near the same type of political capital, because overwhelmingly, yeah, you're going to win the cities regardless. Congrats, we win it by 95%, we win it by 90%. Doesn't change the election. But finally, they don't respond. Literally, Oscar gets up there and says, okay, our worst case is you now vote for the Green Party or the far left party instead. We're in a coalition with them because we're natural allies against the right. And it's totally unclear what the harm is here of losing or bleeding a few votes to the far left. And the critical analysis I'll give you is this. You're always going to lose votes to the far left. You can't compete with the far left for the types of highly educated, socially progressive people they care so much about. And that is because they're not in government. So they can promise things like, we're going to slap a billionaire's tax, which if you're in government, you realize that's kind of tough. And more importantly, because there are no groups further to the left of them, they can promise more extravagant left-wing policy without fear of losing votes to people further to the left. That is why they typically go quite far left and why we cannot effectively compete with them. So at the end of this, we couldn't care less about the educated group of voters that they claim are somehow significant when we already explained that there are just numerically fewer of those people, and that we were never going to capture a large percentage of them because they were economically very conservative, very pro-lower taxation, and very pro-business, which centre-left groups could never support. That is why we overwhelmingly won on the question of the group that was important. Now the question is, how much do we win this group? Because they literally say we should abandon a group that is critical. We say taking a chance under our side is better than nothing at all. Why? The key pushes here, and I think they're best two pushes in the debate. Firstly, you're seen as associating with right-wingers. The problem with this argument is twofold, and that is that rebranding is a modern political tool that has been incredibly successful. It looks like leveraging the immense amount of information from algorithms and data to selectively be able to understand which communities will buy certain narratives, which ads will be effective in which towns. But second, it is the classic tool of you whip on that hard hat the moment you go out into the working class, and the people in the city just don't see that. They don't see the same narratives, and that is why we can effectively target our rebranding to preserve both groups. And the second response to this is, if they see you shifting slightly to the right, does that mean that they hate you? And this was bewildering to me, because educated people overwhelmingly see the working class as their allies. They care about the same policy. They typically are relatively socially progressive and quite empathetic to the plights of people on the ground. And so when you say we're the party of welfare, why do you bleed votes? It's bizarre to me. And the second push they give is that you get less ambitious policy, that you have to kind of moderate yourself. And as we explained in setup, I think it's pretty unlikely that these parties would support that type of thing. They're far more likely to rebrand or message the exact same policy like welfare to these different groups. But the second thing is to point out that voters are relatively pragmatic. If you care a lot about lower tax, you tend to be pretty happy that someone else voted against lowering taxation because, oh, it will cause debt. Even if you're like relatively economically progressive and don't think that debt is a problem, you're still happy that that person voted for the same policy as you. So it doesn't matter in this debate if you just get more voters. And that is why we slam dunk, win on the questions of you successfully rebrand, successfully shift policy to get more votes, and that ultimately gives you more electoral success on the whole.
Thanks, Sadaf, and welcome the final substantive speaker of the debate, the third negative. Welcome, Baylor. You're here.
Yeah, great. She here for me. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Even in the best version of affirmative's world, they only say they get more votes. They never explain why these votes are more meaningful, why these are more likely to translate to long-term success. It is not working class individuals who control media moguls who are able to use social capital to question gerrymandering. The individuals who actually influence lobbying, that we explain from first neg, that we explain in second neg's extension, are individuals who have social capital, who went to university, have networks in USU and USW or UP Diliman, whatever university you are, because you socialize with individuals who actually are there, who graduate from there, and therefore are the politicians who represent you. That is a problem, because even in the best version of affirmative's world, where you indeed get more votes, you either A, are seen as a liar when you go back and change the way that you package your policies, but B, in the best version of the world, indeed dilute the policies you create. Because now under their side, you no longer are seen as a liberal party that promises globalization, but instead you concede a lot of your values, and therefore the policies that your supporters actually were promised to do not happen. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, on the assumption, are these really the core of the progressive movement? Secondly, do you actually change their minds? And this is the core about the analysis about, oh, they're only right-wing for convenience. And lastly, I'll talk about why you'll be successful and why it matters more to prioritize individuals who are more educated. Firstly, the biggest assumption we get from affirmative is that working class indeed are the core of the progressives. The problem is the only way this is built through first and third affirmative is in their interest. Like, I swear, like bestie, there's absolutely zero mech, right? They only say that the working class are the people who lead it, which A is in tension with the info slide, presumably because a lot of these working class individuals, as said in the last part of the info slide, have been captured by right-wing media and they conceded later on. I potentially agree that you can fight it back or whatever, but A, we explain it's not worth it, but secondarily, the majority of them are still succumbing to a lot of right-wing institutions because of the reasons that we said about how oftentimes it is not just parties that influence the way they vote, but also religious institutions. It also is a lot of pressure that they are unable to push against. It also is them not wanting or not having as much time to be able to understand how a lot of these things work because they prioritize economic subsistence. But secondly, we proved that trade unions are not the core of the center-left parties. Instead, it is financing from middle class to upper class educated voters because they are greater in number within these parties, especially because they are indeed the core of these parties, primarily because they are the ones who oftentimes agree with the abstract notions of abortion rights, of gay marriage, of things that are far less economically subsistent, but also secondarily have more influence in politics and business, and that is the core of a lot of them. But lastly, even if it is trade unions that are pro-center-left are not the change in the debate. Most of them actually vote in favor of healthcare already under the Democratic Party because the assumption affirmative makes here is that trade union members are less educated. I think most trade union members who oftentimes are very influential are indeed themselves educated because for them to be able to get a level of capital and social capital and political power, they oftentimes have had to be part of the group that has expanded in a world where you have additional educational influence. So I think if it is the case that indeed trade unions are so crucial and important to the liberal party, these are not individuals who they say are less educated because the kind of weird thing with first affirmative is they equal working class to less educated. I just don't think that's true. A bunch of working class individuals indeed are educated, indeed have gone through university precisely because of the context that is provided in the info side and in first negative. And so the kind of weird words that they use don't actually obscure reality. But even if it's the case that they indeed are the individuals who lead the party, we already explained in the intro that a lot of the time, if they are flippable, and this is something that we concede to, we agree, if they are flippable, the bigger way that we change them and the more inherent way is through going through influence as opposed to appealing to them individually. Because as first affirmative concedes and as second negative flips, if you go to the voters directly, it's very easy to flip them. It's better to change the influential structures that affect the way they vote instead. So that is the ways that their core of the analysis does not work, but also even if it is something that works, the second neg extension and the the confusion coming from the third affirmative is just them not being very charitable to the case. Secondly, are they really just writing for convenience? And broadly, this is the assumption that they make to say that, well, it's very easy to convince a lot of working class individuals because they're only writing for convenience because no one else is appealing to them. I just want to flag that's not, right? For the reasons second affirmative themselves give, right? People in the Rust Belt voted for Trump not because he looks working class. I really think people do not think Trump, who owns the Trump Tower, is working class, but rather because of his isolationist policies that directly affect their jobs, which means that the reliance of less educated voters on economic subsistence always pushes them towards right-wing ideologies as opposed to left-wing policy that fundamentally tells you that you should prioritize arbitrary policies like abortion rights over economic policies that often want to have protectionist policies, which means that I don't think it is true that they are not inherently right-wing. Potentially they are not neo-Nazis. That is not the core of right-wing policy. The core of right-wing policy is economic prioritization and stability and the trust in authority that oftentimes these people are either A, ideologically indoctrinated to believe, as we explained, because these often are the people that surround them, these often are the communities that already have been indoctrinated towards them historically, but secondly as well, these often directly affect them. The second thing they provide, the second thing we explain is just parties alone campaigning does not make them more or less progressive. So even if you do influence them a lot more, second explains if you are less educated, you're probably more exposed to more conservative rhetoric because you do not break out of your social circles when you go to university and are exposed to more diverse individuals, but also secondarily do not have economic mobility to want to research more about what are different pronouns, what are the ways in which a lot of abortion rights happen that cannot be flipped by new electoral strategies, and that is why it is unsuccessful. First affirmative broadly says, well, we should not give up on them. And we aren't. If you believe first affirmative, they already are capturing a portion of the working class, which is their concession, that the current strategy works. But what they oppose is explicitly backtracking and leaving behind a lot of these elites. Second affirmative says, but regardless, at the very least, university students, even if we change the branding of it, don't really care or go far left. The problem with this is it concedes you leave behind supporters. They say that your policies are still the same. Note that they never prove how you can ever package liberals supporting the free market and globalization as beneficial to the Rust Belt. But also secondarily, if you're rebranding them, at worst, you're still leaving them behind. Eventually, or at best, policies still increase inequality and makes lives worse. So that means if you revert back to a lot of your initial policies, that still leaves them behind. Even if you can shift perception, many supporters from political lobbies and backers, and these are the rich elites, rely on the belief of the core liberal ideologies because these are the families that they provided, these are the things that they care about. Shifting priorities is more than does indeed make them leave. An important note and an implication here is you don't just use uni students, you use uni graduates who often end up being the heads of that you probably prioritize. At this point, therefore, there indeed is a trade-off that they are not willing to engage with. But lastly, even if there is not a trade-off, their side says, well, you want to have working class politicians, so it's unrepresentative. They are reliant on working class politicians succeeding. It's very unlikely you'll have that. Firstly, because people who are working class often prioritize their livelihood sakon, you have less time to entertain running for elections and are more likely to opt out. But secondly, first affirmative concedes they're not fully dedicated voters for the right wing anyway, also means that they're not going to be fully dedicated voters to the left wing and therefore do not feel dedicated enough to run. I think that means you do not likely have working class politicians that they relate to. But second, it'll likely be unsuccessful because even when they're working class, people do not view representation as crucial to voting. They still likely buy into narratives of voting for someone who has a degree is equal to smarter because that is the predominant thing that is unfortunately reliant on the world. That is why a lot of working class Asians in liberal democracies like the United States oftentimes vote right wing still because they believe in authority and buy full sale into it. But even when representation is crucial, you will not be able to mobilize sufficient political capital and political will because it's really, really hard to backtrack on your existing strategies. The material here is not to say that it's expensive and that's why you're never going to be able to overcome it, but it is expensive and therefore it is far more efficient to prioritize the strategies that currently are working, prioritize the individuals that are more crucial because they're the ones that actually lobby for you and care the most about you. For these reasons, negative wins on a massive margin.
Thank you to the third negative speaker, and now welcome the negative reply to begin the reply portion of the debate. You hear.
Okay, all right. Hello, everyone. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. The determining factor in this debate is to check if affirmative has sufficiently explained the proof of their benefit. So I'll do 3 things briefly in the speech. Number 1, characterize how this rebranding would work. Affirmative's claim is that rebranding with the same policy would be effective in convincing a lot of these individuals to be able to side with center-left parties in general. So our response was twofold. At 1-0, we said that sending a new politician, which was the claim of the first affirmative, would divide the center-left party unnecessarily, and it would endanger or piss off institutional funders for the entirety of the party, which also incapacitates your own individual party because those individual institutional funders, like the super PACs, like other corporate funders, would very easily be willing to continuously influence other pro-conservative or moderate right-wing individuals as well, which strengthens the entirety of the unity right-wing that they have. Our response at 2-0 was that rebranding is significantly limited by traditionalist pro-conservative institutions like the Catholic Church, or because of my analysis that right-wing policies are easier to exaggerate and have leeway in, like reconciling your nationalist and anti-trade beliefs. And for both of these responses, I think affirmative was significantly lacking in response. They said we could rebrand because, and they provide an example of we can provide more welfare, raise the minimum wage, be able to show that we can have more redistribution and all of these things. Again, the end outcome of having a higher income is something that is very easy to co-opt by many right-wing parties because they can say the same for taking away NAFTA, taking away all of these other things. So the marginal benefit of rebranding does not increase membership, and neither, according to my extension, does it increase loyalty with these members. So even getting them as long-term members that can finance your organizations or give membership or volunteers, or even be able to give you all the swing states that you want is unclear. Number 2, the characterization of these voter demographics. The overgeneralization of affirmative side is to say that, and this is where I do think they run into the significant tautology of this debate. They said, a lot of these trade unions are already leftist. We already have so much control with them. So we need to maintain our base with them and always convince them to still vote with us. And their assumption here is that a lot of these less educated voters are only composed of pro-leftist trade unions that are either leftist or far leftist. Trade unions that have the capacity to organize, specifically trade union leaders, which is the response we provided at 3-0, was to say that they are not always less educated in these circumstances. On the other hand, even if they did end up far leftist, the claim that we made early on in this debate was to explain that far leftism increases the sentiment that creates more divides even within moderate center-left parties. Now, I know that this is a bit late, but center-left parties do involve, as we mentioned, a greater number of individuals that are not just all of these pro-communist or pro-full redistribution individuals that you might want to have. So compromising with many of these segments, as we provided in our speech, is in the interest of the party because there are more voting demographics like the middle educated voters, higher educated voters in universities that are also crucial. But more than this, even in my extension, I said that even higher educated individuals need to be promoted or be prioritized because of the threat of conservative influence within university spaces, to which their response was to only say we'll always have university students because they're always progressive and liberal. I don't know what universities you're going to, but it's not always the case. So our weighing of how these universities play out, how voter demographics play out, is more realistic, more reliable, and proves that many of these voters that you are targeting are ones who will not support you always.
And to finish off a truly excellent silent round, let us go to the affirmative reply to finish off the debate and the in-rounds of Australs 2022. Here.
Am I audible? Cool. Let's start with examining the negative team support win strategy. Let's start with university-educated voters are lost by doing this because they're somehow turned off. The first thing I'll note about this is the negative team throughout this debate cannot decide which it is that turns people off. Is it that they get too close to the center, which they appear to believe at first negative when they talk about Germantion, or is it that they're going to go too far to the loony left, like they say at second act and the negative? I think this lack of clarity about what turning off university-educated voters and the elite looks like actually makes their bench far less persuasive. But as the info slide and as Bella tell you, educated voters are far more rusted on to center-left parties because education disproportionately makes them socially progressive, which means that right-wing parties are typically anathema to them. Right-wing, rich, educated people, on the other hand, have never been a part of this debate because they've never been a part of the coalition of center-left parties. They are the most reliable group for right-wing parties. So it's pretty unclear why this group of people are flocking in the masses that they say they will in this debate. And that should damage their win strategy almost irreparably. The rest of the argument they make appears to be university educators, and they pivot aggressively towards this later in the bench, are more reliable because they have higher rates of turnout, so you ought to prioritize. I'd say this is asserted in ways that border on classist at points in this debate. Our argument is that it may very well be that this group of people are unreliable voters. Some countries have compulsory voting, by the way. And it might be particularly difficult when university educated voters are not the majority of populations that vote in Ba'ath party margins for center-left parties. You need another part of your coalition in order to win elections. And we say that's working class voters, less educated voters. You must fight for them even if they are unreliable. They say, well, you lack organizations that, are important mouthpieces for you. And they snuff at trade unions, which have enormous donor networks, which have huge capital, which have huge media networks that they rely on. But even if you totally believe the aggressive pivot they move in the neg block to, which is you'll lose super PACs, you'll lose donor funding, there's limited explanation of why being an elite, why you turn off those elite people, but why their money is so critical to winning an election. If it is the case that you're deciding to lose a group of voters you just axiomatically need to win elections. So you need to ask the only question worth asking left. Do we succeed at appealing to working class people? We have three pushes on this. First, we combat the disconnect with people not seeing themselves in the leadership by having less educated and working class voters in the party. We support policies like trade protectionism that are very popular in rural areas and that have seen people in recent times flocking to populist parties. We frame existing policies that we have as being specifically, in a micro-targeting sense, beneficial to working class voters. They do not directly try to refute these claims, I think because they know they're true. They just try to put things in the way. They say, oh, there's a first mover advantage, so you'll never do it. But this is a recent phenomenon, as the info slide presages. And conceivably, even at the most uncharitable interpretation of our case, there is a benefit to trying to dilute what is essentially an undiluted pipeline of populist right voters communicating with the central demographic. They say, well, they're captured by media networks anyway. That's not proven structurally. We've given extensive explanations of why their interests align more with centre-left parties, why centre-left parties ought try to align their messaging with this group of people, and they've never given an explanation of why you could not do that. And I guess, to conclude, they never grapple with the narrative we set on this debate from first speaker. Centre-left parties need desperately to engage with the question of education polarisation, because it's not a question for a centre-left party to lose them entirely. They just can't do it. There are a huge voter base that just won't disappear without any structural reasoning. Bella explains they won't disappear. We're the only team with a viable route to keeping these people voting for centre-left parties. And we're the only team that therefore sees centre-left parties winning elections consistently in the future. For that reason, you must vote for the affirmative team.
Thanks, everyone. Excellent silent round. That's that. See you at the break.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for the round, everyone.